Welcome to today's webinar, Building Trust in Philanthropy with Deeper Stories and Clear Language. We will begin in just a moment. Some event reminders before we get started. For any technical issues, please submit a message through to the chat to our host and panelists at the bottom of your screen, or email us at webinars@cof.org. We'll be happy to help you. For automated live transcript, click at the bottom of your screen to select Show Subtitles or View Full Transcript. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all participants alongside any resources shared throughout our event. Finally, if you have any comments, please use the chat feature to chat with our host and panelists. We'll be looking forward to all your questions. At this time, I'm happy to hand it over to Nicole Bronzan, our VP of Communication and Content here at the Council on Foundations.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Welcome everyone to our webinar today. We could not be more excited to tell you a little bit about this project, which is, believe it or not, about 1.5 years in the making. And that's just the work part, not the kind of, running around in my brain it's been doing for a long time. But the result is the largest ever study on narrative and philanthropy. And today we're going to dive into really the data specifically, and then some actionable recommendations that we make in the report. And then we want to hear from you. So first, I'd love to just introduce myself and my co-panelists. My name is Nicole Bronzan. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Content at the Council on Foundations. I am a recovering journalist and also a veteran of philanthropy as well. So very excited for all of this. Anne, would you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. So great to have you joining us. My name is Anne Searight Christiano. I'm the director of the Center for Public Interest Communications at the University of Florida. I also have a long background in philanthropy as well, so recovering philanthroper. And I'm happy to hand over to my colleague, Aaron Zeiler.
Hello. So nice to see you all. Not really see you all today, but my name is Aaron Zeiler. I'm the Director of Partner Strategies at the Center, and really excited to share all these findings that we've been working so hard on for the last 1.5 years. So back to you, Nicole.
All righty. And just want to say, Yu Hao, the researcher who was supposed to be on the call with us today, could not make it. So sorry. We're going to do our best to walk you through the data ourselves. One last housekeeping thing, as Melissa said, you can put your questions to us in the chat. If we have specific clarification questions, we will pause to get everything clear. For longer substantive questions, we will wait till the end. And then we obviously have some questions for you. So without further ado, let's jump into the agenda today. So we're going to first tell you a little bit of background, how we got here and why, then talk through our findings in a couple of phases of research, then go into our recommendations, which really come out of the findings, some next steps, and then your Q&A. All right, so we want to talk a little bit about how this all came about. As you have probably seen and heard, if you've been, I don't know, anywhere in philanthropy or nonprofits in the past few months, you have probably seen this piece from McSweeney's, which we all really laughed at and also probably kind of cringed at. A key line from this piece, so how does our staff spend its time? We can describe it in 3 words. We drive change. Then one of my favorite quotes, we leverage resources to build capacity. We align partners for impactful solutions. We address needs, embolden stakeholders, empower the powerless, and give voice to the voiceless. In short, that's a lot of words that say pretty much nothing. And so while we laughed at this piece, we also were sort of thinking, yeah, this research is right on time. And it resonates really because of some things we've been saying to each other for a long time. Our stories, metaphors, and communications don't help people understand our work. And that's really what we want. So it's a big problem for us. We tend to think now about the importance of transparency. So we talk about how much money we raise and how much money we spend and how we spend it. But really that transparency, the financial data without the context, without the stories that bring it to life, is like a pile of windows with nothing to hold it up. It doesn't help you see into anything. And we know that foundations are required by law to share certain data, including on the 990s for the IRS, But we also do ourselves no favors with our press releases and what we like to call press release stories. I'm sure you've all seen them. X Foundation gives X billion dollars for Y cause. And it's just a very kind of, it's all focused on the money. It doesn't tell you where the money goes to. It's just sort of a, oh, it's for equitable transformation in this community. And then, of course, there's the jargon, right? We leverage resources to build capacity. What does that mean? And could you talk to your neighbor about it? Probably not. Or your, 5-year-old or 10-year-old? Probably not. So it just doesn't help anybody understand how the work actually happens. It makes it mysterious. And that's never good when you want people to understand and trust you, especially not in this country. The other thing that we don't do very well is use metaphors. We tend to choose metaphors that come from sectors that are not like our own. War, for example, sports. I can't tell you how many times a day I catch myself saying, you hit it right on target, you hit the nail on the head, or let's take a stab at it, right? We all talk about the front lines and the battleground and impact, or we use sports metaphors. And really, at the end of the day, people may understand the general concept of what we're talking about, but we're framing it, and we'll talk more about this later, in a way that is very zero-sum and not helpful to how we want people to see this work. This is all in and of itself not great, but then you add the current context in our nation today. So we've got senators who are accusing foundations of interfering in elections. And we want to be clear that good and thoughtful, appropriate oversight is really important. The council stands by it. We definitely want that, and we need it for a healthy sector. But what we are seeing actually is confusion about what foundations do. We see conflation with dark money. So you see our Senator Sheldon Whitehouse here on the left. And then there was actually a great piece in NPR, I think it was 2022. They have a Throughline podcast that dives into kind of why things are the way they are, how they came to be that way. And there was this deep dive on philanthropy. And, really thoughtful piece. Again, great, check it out. It's a great history about sort of how this all started and even how some of these issues come from, the same place that they did 200, 300 years ago. And, at the end of the day, we have to be aware of these critiques, whether they're warranted or not, right? And we have to also just sort of have that humility to understand that this is natural. Some of this criticism may be warranted. There's a lot of power going on. And a key point that was made actually in this Throughline episode, you can't vote out the foundations that are all the money and the political influence and the popular influence behind these programs. So, this is a country built on this idea that, the people have the power. And so if you're talking about billions of dollars in this, this sort of mysterious sector that no one understands, that doesn't breed trust. So the other piece of background we want to talk about just briefly was a study that came out last year by our friends at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. And this blew us away for a couple reasons. First, more than 3/4 of Americans say that society benefits when we donate to charity. That's probably not going to surprise anybody. People think charity is good. And, what we've seen this over and over in other surveys as well. My favorite part of this survey, and I have talked about it ad nauseum, is actually this little tiny piece that comes further down. Even though people think charity is good and people trust philanthropy, just 5.4% of respondents said they or anyone in their immediate family had received services from a charitable organization in the last year. So they or their family members. And when you think about the scope of nonprofits, and obviously the philanthropy that supports those nonprofits, from hospitals to the Y, where your kids go to, soccer, to the churches and the food pantries, yes. All of these ways that nonprofits serve us in our life, and people just don't see that that's what's happening. So the big things that we're seeing here, just in the context of our American society today, yes, the American people and Congress, we'll get to that as well, they have generally positive feelings about philanthropy, but they don't know much about it. So in that sense, foundations are a blank slate. And that also means that we have a blank slate because we have the opportunity to define ourselves the way we want to. And that's really important because if you don't define yourself, you leave yourself open for others to define you, which is sort of what we're afraid of here.
Thanks, Nicole. So you may wonder, as we explore this project, why did we turn first to stories? Why didn't we develop 30 messages and focus group them and test them through polling? And here we're really turning to Heather McGee. Heather McGee, if you've read her book, listened to her podcast, you've heard her say, everything we believe comes from a story that we've been told. And the truth is that the science backs her up. Stories help us make sense of our world. They convey our expectations of how the world should work. Some of the science behind stories tells us that they improve comprehension, they increase self-efficacy, they influence people's real-world beliefs, and they can successfully persuade otherwise resistant audiences. They can also help us contextualize data and provide clarity. The other thing that I think is really important is to recognize that the building blocks of story is the language that we choose. We know that what we believe comes from stories, and that those stories become deeply tied to our beliefs. And finally, it's true that stories are the vessels of culture, and culture is networked. So if we want to change culture, we have to change story and narrative. So that leads us to talking about our headline findings: better stories, better language. And we're going to go through these, though I want to really urge you to read the report and dive into the appendices. We've got about 300 pages of appendices where you can really look at all of the different research methodology and the insights that we drew from each phase of this research. There's a lot there, and we have worked hard to make sure that we're showing our work. So we set out to learn what shapes our perceptions of foundations among policymakers and the larger public. Which storytelling elements might increase the public's understanding of and trust in foundations? And how do communications practitioners in philanthropy approach their work? So Aaron, do you want to talk a little bit about our research methods?
Absolutely. So now we really want to explain how we got to 300 pages of appendices, which is absolutely. But for this project, we really wanted to focus in on the three groups that Anne alluded to in our research questions. And those are practitioners, policymakers, and the American public. And so I'll walk you through the 6 different methods that we used for this phase of the report. And those are practitioner interviews and a sector survey. So the sector survey we sent out through a snowball sample, which means we relied on the networks that we have connections with to share the survey. And we got about 77 responses. And then for the practitioner interviews, we had sit-down conversations with a researcher and people that work either in or with philanthropy to kind of understand where their storytelling practices are now. And then for policymakers, we started with interviews. We met a bit of resistance because at the end of last year, a few little things were happening to really make the world a bit busier for US Congress. But we were able to have some sit-down interviews with 4 congressional staffers. And then we bolstered our findings in this area with content analysis of Congressional Research Service reports and with social listening of policymakers' social media. And then lastly, we did a very, very large national survey of almost 3,600 people. And we're really excited to share these findings with you. So here's a quick overview of what we found, and then we'll go into more depth when we go into the recommendations. So at first, we found that all stories build trust, and some stories are more effective. When we tested stories to see, okay, how can this resonate with the American public, we found that a controlled description worked fine, but every story that we gave actually did do a better job of raising trust. But where the money went and details about how decisions are made did an extra great job at explaining this work. Next, we found that there are opportunities to help policymakers better understand philanthropy. In our conversations with congressional staffers, we heard a lot of positive feedback about foundations, but there was also some confusion about what foundations do, how do they make decisions, and how can they best help Congress members provide resources to their constituents. A quote here that we really enjoyed was, "I look at the foundation sector or philanthropic sector as a proving ground of what is possible," really leaning into this idea of partnership. Next, we saw that there is no shared narrative about how philanthropy works that is meaningful to the American people. And this is going back to what Nicole was saying about the blank slate. Since there's nothing really tying what philanthropy does, and it can be so mysterious, the lack of narrative really makes it hard for people to understand what foundations actually do. So part of our recommendations then become a little preview that we should work on telling better stories to build this sort of narrative. And lastly, when we surveyed practitioners that worked at foundations or with the philanthropic sector, we found that they need some more support in doing this work. Only 47.4% of the respondents said that they were feeling supported in their storytelling efforts, and that they needed more things like more time, more funding to do this work, more connections with program teams to get interviews with people who are directly affected by the issues that they were working on. So as you're considering this, think about how you can provide more support for this work. And so we also found that our research suggests that if the sector made a commitment to this meaningful type of transparency, we could accumulate to a shared narrative that would help build more trust in philanthropy as a whole. So I'm going to pass it back over to Anne to walk us through an overview of our recommendations.
Thanks, Erin. So we don't want to just present you with a bunch of data and then just leave you to interpret it for yourselves. We saw in the research some clear recommendations for what we can do differently as individual participants in this sector and for the sector as a whole. So we're going to don't scramble to write all of these down right now. We're going to walk you through each of these, provide you with some examples, and also offer you some deeper recommendations that support all of these. So let's start with the first one, tell stories within complex ecosystems. So Nicole mentioned earlier this idea, this reality that a lot of times we get the news release out, right? And it's around this really simplistic story of how a funder is going to magically address a particular issue with a particular dollar amount. But those kinds of stories and the stories in which we try to convey our impact are often built around single heroes, that sort of Batman narrative where somebody comes in with a significant amount of money to save the day. The story jumps to the hoped for resolution. But these stories are really relying and reinforcing individualistic narratives and those sort of bootstrap narratives. They don't talk about the systems in which the conditions we're trying to address reside. And let's also acknowledge that these kinds of stories often invoke some stigmatizing language and stereotypes as well. So we want to get away from these simplistic stories and lean into more complex stories. So what are the things that those more complex stories might include? Context. Let's talk about where the systems came to be and where how these issues evolved. Let's tell stories about coalitions and people working together to solve a challenge, to show that collaborative action is possible. Let's skip the savior narratives. Let's stop telling stories that leave us waiting for heroes who aren't coming. Let's draw the connections among the people who are taking action from different perspectives. Let's talk about the communities, the grantees, the people within the foundation, and the people outside that immediate network. And let's talk about the details that the community's taken, even the stuff that seems mundane, like writing the 30-page proposal or getting all of the documentation in by the deadline. Those mundane details make the process visible. It shows that this work is not magic, and it makes the process more accessible to the people who can benefit most. So to share an example of this, going back to Heather McGee, in the chapter of her book, Ignoring the Canary, she does a fantastic job of modeling the very kind of storytelling we're describing. This particular chapter is about the mortgage crisis that unfolded in 2008. And while that mortgage crisis was the result of a very complex series of events, she tells the story through the experience of Janice and Isaiah Tomlin. And one of the things that she describes in this chapter is how lenders initially disproportionately targeted Black homeowners with these sort of predatory mortgages for people who already had mortgages in good standing. And her telling of this story includes the policy decisions that made it easier for lenders to target entire communities with these kinds of loans, the corporate practices that focused on Black borrowers first, and also the real consequences for families and entire communities. So she weaves all of these threads together and all of their complexity, and she makes sense of these stories in a way that few other accounts of what happened in that time do.
So then what comes next? Well, we want you to lean into your role as trusted messengers and to tell great and ethical stories. I'll start by talking about trusted messengers. One thing we found when we replicated the survey that Lily did was that their findings that trust in foundations is higher than other institutions still remain true. And we found this as well when we talked to policymakers. We found that they felt similarly about partnerships. One congressional staffer told us that she really enjoyed that one foundation came and spoke to their member of Congress and said, hey, this is what we are doing in your state, in your constituency. And here are the nonprofits that are making an effect on the issues that you care about. And here are all the places where you could get additional funding in this space, really describing what that foundation did for that community and what the nonprofit ecosystem there really does for that community day to day was incredibly helpful in increasing trust and that really positive feeling about philanthropy. And so with that still in mind, we have building on that approach. We want to build on that approach. So how can you identify spaces where you are the trusted messenger, where you are the person that can go into the office and say, hey, here's what's going on in your community, and here's all the people in the space that can really help you out. We also want you to tell stories with relatable characters and vivid details that transport us into their different viewpoints, really getting back at that first recommendation as well, that nice ecosystem storytelling. Then we also want you to adhere to ethical storytelling principles, which Anne will talk to you about in a second. And then you want you to build transparent relationships with communities and policymakers that clearly and accurately define what foundations can or can't do. And lastly, we want you to value the voices and perspectives of people closest to the work in terms of inclusion and compensation.
Thanks, Erin. So the report includes a section called Keep Learning. And one of the pieces that we made sure to include is the work of two organizations that we really admire in this space, including Defined American, that we think is doing some of the best work in the country around ethical storytelling. And they've put together a fantastic framework that includes a lot of the elements that Erin mentioned. One of the things that we want to particularly underscore is the importance of including the voices of people who are closest to a condition and who are part of bringing their lived experience to overcoming a challenge, making sure that there is space in your storytelling for those individuals to talk about the condition in their voice, but also leaving them with control about when that story is used and how that story is used to make sure that the reason that you're telling the story aligns with their values and what's important to them.
Next, we want you to say what you mean and mean what you say. Going back to what Nicole was talking about earlier, we have a really strong reliance on philanthropy. That is all the complex tax jargon, all the terms that we know very well, but people outside of philanthropy might not know as well, or the metaphors that sound really great, but when you get into it, what are they really communicating? What are we actually getting across? And there's been a lot of really great talk about this recently. All the words that you see on screen were pulled from different articles about philanthropy and like what we should really be taking out of our language. And by doing that, we can give a more clear version of what foundations actually do. We're not just capacity building, like what does that actually mean? So for this to really work, we don't want you to abandon metaphors. I know I just said, metaphors, what do they mean? We want you to think really, really clearly about the metaphors you choose, so that they reflect an abundance mindset instead of directly or indirectly suggesting that there is this zero sum. You have to compete. I think one practitioner said that we don't want our grantee partners to be competing for peanuts. That's the kind of zero sum thinking that we want to move away from. We also want you to use clear visual language and definitions, things that really, if it seems confusing, spelling it out to make it really clear and understandable. And so we actually ended up testing some metaphors. And these are all metaphors that we saw foundations using, either on their websites, in conversation, in presentations. We really wanted to make sure that we were testing things that were actually being used by the sector. And we included this in our national survey when we asked Americans, okay, now that you've gone through the stories we presented you, which of these metaphors do you think most accurately describes what foundations do? And what we found is all of these metaphors that foundations are using now were resonating with Americans. And what we think that really means is you have no loss there if you switch to using abundance metaphors rather than zero-sum metaphors. The people that you're speaking to are still going to have some resonance with what you do, but you can better describe the work you do for your partners so that they will provide better stories or may not feel like they have to compete for peanuts, like I just said. So we really encourage you to start using these abundance metaphors. And like I said, all of these are metaphors that the sector is already using. So it's not like we have to fully build a new lexicon, though we definitely can together. But you're already on the right step. Keep going.
Great. So the next principle recommendation that we want to share with you is really to lean into the right kind of transparency. We know that foundations are accountable for filing their 990 PF each year. And if you know what a 990 PF is, it can be a really great source of information in what's important to a particular foundation, what their average grant sizes are, and a form of accountability. But people aren't necessarily going to go looking for your 990 PF. And for the people that we talk to, this isn't the kind of transparency that we want. Policymakers, practitioners, and Americans all told us and showed us that they want more transparency. Policymakers want to be able to pass along stories to their constituents that can help them understand how the foundations that may be able to help them actually work. And this is really a way to provide value. The right kind of transparency includes some of those mundane details I described before, but they also include getting really specific about where the money goes. So it's one thing to say that we gave $100 bajillion to the Nicole Bronzan nonprofit in our community because we like Nicole Bronzan a lot, but really detailing that with that funding, Nicole Bronzan was able to hold meetings in her communities in places that would not have otherwise been accessible, and to make sure that everybody was able to get to the meeting, and to make sure that people who had jobs were able to take time off to get to the meeting, or that in the story that we particularly tested, that we were able to purchase a particular form of equipment that had previously been out of reach and made it possible for a community to do something it hadn't done before. So getting really granular about the ways in which the funds and the dollars write checks that make things possible that weren't possible before. We also saw strong trust associated with, I'm sorry, can you go back for 1 second, with how decisions are made? Okay, you can go on to the next slide. How decisions are made. So really talking about those nitty-gritty details, like where did the foundation come from? Was it the brainstorm of somebody within a foundation, or did they talk to somebody in their community who had a really great idea for how to make a difference? Making stories feel more authentic with the details about making the copies and setting up the chairs and having the meeting and the file not saving and all of those things that are a part of our daily lives as change makers, but don't often show up in our narratives. Really being specific about how people are using the money, getting away from those formulaic stories, including the perspectives of people deep within your organization, how they're thinking about a particular opportunity or challenge. And also telling stories about what may not have worked and being really transparent about failure in the context of the larger trajectory of success and innovation.
Thank you, Anne. I actually think one great example of this comes from the world of journalism and thinking like a journalist. So the story that you see on screen is about a program that is coming in Philadelphia, but what this journalist, I think, does really well is she goes to everyone that is involved in this program. She talks to the founder, she talks to the foundation, she talks to the university that also participated in this work, to the chef that participates, the community that was involved, the community leaders, and she quotes them. She talks about how they all interacted together. And it's a really great story of how you can show how many people are included in this process and how this work actually gets done. It's really important to do things like that because it demystifies the process. Somebody sees this and says, oh, wow, this is a really great thing. This is a wonderful idea. And I see the steps that I can take so that I can also participate in this in the long run. Next, we're getting kind of bigger here, but we want you to commit to sector-wide storytelling to fill the narrative vacuum. So we've talked a lot today about different practices individual organizations can do for storytelling. And that is the very, very important first step. Because much like how we think about stars, each star can be an individual story, to borrow a quote from Kamal Sinclair. But each of these stories can be an individual star. And as the sky fills with stars, we could start building constellations and connections that build to a larger story. So we hope, to a larger narrative. So we hope that you will start practicing these stories so that in the long term, individual foundations are telling better stories that then build to this larger narrative. And then we also hope that you will find time to come together and start thinking about, okay, how can we work together? Not in a way of like giving you 3 sentences that every foundation should use, but rather a sensibility, a way that we can communicate with each other so that we're talking about our own work, but in a similar frame. We're singing from the same songbook, but we're using different melodies, harmonies. I'm not a musician, you can tell that now, but here is that different approach slide. So we want you to be deliberate about working within individual foundations and collaboratively with the field to identify themes that honestly depict how foundations work. And we want you to incorporate those themes into a larger narrative strategy for the sector. And we'll do that over time. Let's start with the individual stories first, but this is kind of a preview to where we could be going. And then we want you to tailor those themes in the long run to your individual organization's values and vision. And I'm going to pass it to Anne for our last recommendation.
Terrific. Thank you, Erin. So our last recommendation is to commit the time and the resource that are necessary to supporting and elevating this kind of long-term narrative change work. So when we surveyed practitioners, one of the things that we saw is y'all are telling stories. That is very clearly part of your habits. You're using stories, you're telling stories, as many of you said, on a weekly basis or at least once a month. Only one person in the entire survey said that they're not using stories. So this is a really common practice. We are already storytellers. We're already using narrative as a way to explain our work. So what we're asking you to do is to invest more in that process, to apply these principles, to make sure that the stories are helping people understand not just the what, but the why and the how in these really detailed ways that have this larger cumulative effect of showing how change happens. Because change isn't magical. It takes a really long time and it's incredibly hard work. We loved this quote from Rinku Sen, who said, she said, when funders today talk about, I've been funding narrative for 2 years or 5 years and things haven't changed, I think to myself, you haven't been funding narrative. You've been funding strategic communications, maybe more strategic, maybe less strategic, but communications. And you've been funding short-term efforts and an environment that is unfriendly to them. And I think that really sort of encapsulates the fact that this is a long game. This is a cumulative game. This is a time when, oh, look, I just used a sports metaphor. And we acknowledge that what we're asking you to do is hard because we have, as I just demonstrated, these embedded habits and these embedded patterns. But history shows that when we can commit to that long-term view and put in the hard work over time, that can really benefit society as a whole. Rinku has made the point to us that changing the narrative about slavery in America took 50 years before we could finally elect a president who agreed that it was wrong and was willing to do something about it. So really recognizing that because we haven't seen change in 2 years or 5 years doesn't mean we're failing. It means that we have more to do. So we want to encourage you to be part of that long view, making deeper investments into the team that is leading your storytelling strategy, making sure, like one of the things that we saw is that the kinds of things that people were trying to tell stories about and their programmatic communications goals and their mission statements were not in alignment. And so really thinking about how those things might align and looking to see how they are. Looking at developing some new metrics that actually evaluate your narrative efforts. I know we're not usually enthusiastic about metrics that are focused on output, but maybe creating a rubric for yourself to say, am I including the voices of people closest to the problem? Am I including those mundane details that help people understand how change happens? And working with other foundations to maybe look at some shared metrics and what resources might still be needed to incorporate shared metrics that we can use across the field.
Thanks so much, Anne. And you know, as Anne said, this is a long game. We're just going to keep that metaphor for now. It works. It's not violent in and of itself. So let's talk a little bit about where we go from here, because the research is, you know, really the science that backs up how we need to do these things, but we still have to get out there and do the work. And we understand that that's not that easy all the time. This is just the beginning, really, of a conversation we want to have with you, hoping that as we apply the research, we can, you know, build tools, build those shared narratives together, and then find and share examples. I hate to tell you that when we were writing the report, we were trying to find examples within philanthropy of people doing this the way we were recommending. And as you see, we had to go to books and some journalism stories and other things. We really didn't find this out there. So we would love to see that more in the field. And really, again, making sure that we're hearing from you, we'll get to there in just a second, about what you need. Now that we have the science and we have the how and the why, you know, what is it that you need? So we're going to move into that section. We just want to very quickly take a moment to acknowledge everybody who really was a part of this work. Like I said, it was, you know, a year and a half of work and some late nights and some, you know, a lot of contracts and, you know, again, telling the details, right? I mean, it's not all glamour, these report writing. But, you know, everybody from University of Florida, from the Center for Public Interest Communications, and then from the Council as well. This has been an amazing partnership. So now we want to hear from you. You've heard some of the data, you've heard our recommendations and even some specific examples. We're really interested in where you're reading the report and you say, I would love to do that, but what are those buts? Where do you need something? Where is a barrier in the way? I'll just say one thing that came to my mind immediately when we did the report was thinking about the metrics that we use, because as I think Anne mentioned, one of the things we saw was that folks had these storytelling goals and these goals for their communications generally, but then the metrics, and so the goals might be something like increase understanding of the issue we work on, but then the metrics were clicks and likes, right? We're not measuring what we're actually trying to achieve here. And so we need to rethink our metrics as well. So that's in my mind, but I would love to hear other things. And again, you can put your questions in the chat. I will monitor that and kind of throw them out to the appropriate expert. The first one we have, actually, we've got Marie. She says, how does the need for in-depth storytelling with lots of details and viewpoints intersect with the popularity of platforms where stories have to be short? Great question.
I have thoughts.
Go for it.
I think it's important to recognize that there are lots of different places in which we tell stories. So yes, it is certainly true that if you're clicking through CNN or BuzzFeed or lots of other news sites, the stories that you're going to see are really short. But there are lots of different places in which we tell and apply stories in the presentations that you make to communities, in your calls for proposals, in your own communications. It's also true, I think the story that Erin shared is a great example that a story doesn't have to be long to capture these really compelling details. And in fact, these details that we're encouraging and this approach that we're encouraging you to take can actually make the story itself more compelling because it's applying what research tells us is called narrative transportation, the visual details that create verisimilitude and make it feel as though something has happened to us. So I would not allow yourself to feel kind of constrained by that limitation.
And I would just add too, without too much snark, that I think we are already as a field pretty verbose on our own channels. You go to websites and you see stories and there are 1,000 words or 2,000 words. So if we're gonna do that, let's at least do it right? And maybe the Twitter post or X post that links to that story is short, or maybe make a TikTok that sort of distills it. But I think at the end of the day, that's one benefit, right, of this new age, is that we have the space if we want it, and we need to use it well. It doesn't mean every single thing is going to be long, but even thinking about when you're writing a speech for the CEO, right? Can we pull in a story that's not just, I saw this guy and he was, this poor guy, and now look, amazing. Not magic, right? That's not what we want. Lots of questions coming in. So if you're the communications lead at your organization, how do you convince your leadership that this is worth more investment? I feel like my saying it isn't enough. Good point. Did you show them the report? That's what you should do first. Any other thoughts?
Nicole, I think you should actually answer this question.
I knew you were going to say that. I mean, I think this is a good start, right? I mean, like I said, the science has to come first. That's why we didn't just come out and say, here's how you should do this stuff, right? We wanted to test these things and show that they actually build trust. I don't think anybody needs convincing right now that trust is at all-time lows, and that even the nonprofit sector, which is the most, or I think the second most trusted, is suffering from that. And so, anybody at a foundation should be concerned about that. And I think, showing them this report and saying, look, this is the largest study of narrative philanthropy, and they say X. The other thing I think, and I've been at foundations, I've been at nonprofits. Sometimes it's hard to quantify the effects of narrative. And so that's actually something that I'm really interested in digging into as a next step here, is how can we measure this, right? Without long, expensive studies. How can you show the effect that you're having? That's not just, likes and clicks, because that really doesn't show what we're talking about. So to be continued, but we are definitely thinking about that. Let's see here. As storytellers, what can we do to gain the trust of foundations and philanthropies so that they open up and share details of their internal procedures and decision-making? Good question.
Well, I think the first step is really to show them the data, but showing that there are these stories about, okay, how decisions are made, how the money is spent, really helps build trust, not just with the American public. We heard from so many of the, or we heard from the congressional staffers that we spoke with, that they really wanted to know what happens. They wanted the detail. They wanted to know, how did you come to your mission statement? How does that align with the values of my district or my state? What are the things that are actually available? Because they also said that there's some of the language feels mysterious or kind of confusing, a bit for them, but especially for their constituents. So there's really a deep value into going into these details. And then I also think it requires a lot of conversations between foundations and other philanthropic entities. Like, let's get together at conferences. Let's get together in spaces where we're all together to start thinking through, okay, I'm starting this. I'm seeing it's kind of working very well. Maybe you should do this too. And how can I help you build and grow on this? I think one example that I really enjoy is the Stupsky Foundation. They do a great job of splitting up a story. I saw another question in the chat is like, how do you balance like these long detailed stories with a bunch of different, the need for shorter stories for people's attention spans? Well, I think one way you can do that is take your story and split it up. Provide a series. It gives you more content, which we always love. Great for those output metrics that Anne was talking about. But it also allows us to see multiple vantage points. And so the Stupsky Foundation does that. They talk to a program officer. They talk to someone in the community. They talk to the grantee partners they're working with. All these different viewpoints really help show the decisions, but also the vastness of this work, all the people that are involved. And it really leans on this really great benefit that foundations have of being able to step back and see all the connections and help people see all the connections. So really reiterating that and working together to build that.
All right. We're in a big election year, yes. And I'm already seeing foundations being openly criticized, particularly from MAGA Republican candidates who are publicly attacking DEI funding that supports LGBTQ+ communities, reproductive freedom, and much more. Yes, this is long-term work, but any advice on how this research could interact with the so-called crisis communications? Well, I'll start because obviously, you know, we're hearing a lot of things from our members, and I think the whole charitable sector is kind of a little bit on edge about this issue. I think this really goes back to the last or second to last recommendation about working together on these narratives, with emphasis on the together. One thing that I think is really interesting, you know, I've worked at tiny nonprofits. I've worked in journalism outfits, and here at the council, sort of looking out to the field, we don't see as much as I would like of folks getting together and saying, well, what are you hearing? What do you say? What are you seeing? And what are you going to say? And, you know, when I was working in advocacy, that was a key part of any campaign, right? Was you have to get together with other folks, including folks who may not believe everything you believe, and, you know, say, we have a common goal here. Let's work together. So that's something that we're hoping will come out of this, is that individually foundations, yes, will commit to different kinds of storytelling, but also that we will as a sector come together and say, we have a shared interest, no matter what you're funding or what, you know, where you find yourself on the political spectrum. You know, we believe that philanthropy is an integral part of society. So when you do that, you build those relationships, right? And you also come to hear things that you maybe didn't hear before, and maybe you learn new things and actually meet new people. And I think that's where you suddenly have the resources that you didn't have if you're attacked on, I don't know, the Senate Finance Committee floor. You know, you actually kind of know what's going on. And I think one of the things that we really want to see is, you know, the whole sector, including private foundations, community foundations, corporate foundations, you know, LLCs. We want to see everybody seeing themselves as a sector, right? In the same way that I always say this, the dairy lobby, right? They have an association. I'm sure the automakers have one and the filmmakers have one, and they're interested in above their own personal interest. They're interested in the field, and that's what we have to do as philanthropy. So that's my first thing, is just a plea for us to do that, to just sort of come together. But any more thoughts about how this work kind of intersects with that crisis communications mode?
Can I just chime in on this? Because I have thoughts. And I think that is so well said about the importance of the field working together and like finding our people, reinforcing. I also, and this may be a controversial perspective, but I also don't think that we are required to use the language that has been weaponized. When we do use that language in a shorthand without saying what it really means, we create an opportunity for people to fill it with meaning. And the meaning that they fill it with may not be the meaning that we intended. And so I think we have to be accountable. Aaron said, we have to say what we mean and mean what we say. And using heuristics and shorthand and acronyms create that openness for our message to be exploited and filled with somebody else's meaning.
If I could add one more thing, building off of what Anne said, I think what's interesting about crisis comms is it's rooted in the same thing that this work is. It's rooted in trust, and it requires that level of trust in advance. So as Anne said, saying what you mean and meaning what you say, going back further before you're even close to a crisis, is going to be very, very important. So practicing these different recommendations we gave today. And there's also a really great resource about trust from Spitfire that they just released. So also look there. But doing that work early is going to be very, very important, so that you're thinking about what words you're saying in advance. You're not leaving things to be vague. You're starting to be more specific. And it's a lot more difficult to approach specific things with those levels of critique. So start applying these practices early and often.
Okay, we're gonna take a hard one. For a decade, we have been a storytelling organization, and now that we are seeing exponential success, our leadership wants to take funding to be the boots on the ground and move away from being a communications foundation. In what ways can I advocate for continued storytelling without appearing unsupportive of the board's desire to move in a new direction? That's a tough one.
I have thoughts. Aaron has thoughts too. Aaron, you go.
it.
You go first.
Oh, nice. Okay. So this is a really great reminder that our actors are not just, or the people we want to take action are not just the American public. There are so many different actors that we interact with every day that need to hear some level of storytelling. We don't just tell stories to build our brands. We tell stories to help build understanding with the people we're working with. And so if there is that shift to try and give additional funding to people that are doing the work day to day, you still need to tell them the story about how this actually works. Because something that happens far too often is you have new nonprofits in the space coming in and saying, what is this application process? How do I do this? They might not necessarily have a fundraising person on their team to help them move through this. And so storytelling can really help make that objective, that goal, more possible. Here are the steps that have to happen. Here is the person that does this work on the programs team. And so shifting, maybe it's pitching this work as we do storytelling to talk to this very important group of actors that need to know this as well. So let's just shift our storytelling ideas. We need some funding to do that, but we can be more specific with our storytelling in that way.
And I would just add that the leadership, that is a fantastic answer, Aaron. The only little tiny thing I would add is just observing that the leader of your organization's using that military metaphor of boots on the ground. And that, so they clearly still need you to be doing this work. And second, that they're gonna, with that kind of grant making to be effective, it costs a lot. That means that you have to pull every lesson you can from that so that not just the grantees are benefiting from that funding, but the larger sector has the opportunity to learn from it as well. So I think that transition makes it all the more important to capture the narrative of how that approach is leading to change so that others can replicate it.
Fantastic. So we have a question about different narrative platforms. Did we do any research around how stories are received on different platforms? For example, written word versus video, social versus web. I know that we didn't, but I would love for you to speak to the bigger question, which is, does this matter in our storytelling?
I think this is somewhere where we can go next with this. Something that we learn working with researchers is that you can't put everything into a survey, no matter how much you really want to put everything into a survey. And so this would be something that we would want to look at in the future, I would think. How does the medium of storytelling change in that way? So maybe in a future phase of this work.
To add to that, for sure, more work is needed, but we also know from the science of narrative transportation that visual details, whether we read them or see them, increase that sense of narrative transportation. So there are lots of reasons that film transports us in ways that written word can't, because we're firing more visuals at our eyeballs per second when we're experiencing that. So it makes sense that video might more quickly transport us. But even if we are using those written stories, if you want people to be engrossed in your stories, to feel like it happened to them, we've got to be visual communicators regardless of the medium and really leaning into that tangible, tactical, concrete language.
So we are very close to time. I would just want to quickly nod to a question that came in earlier that I think we touched on a little, but I wanted to specifically address it. We're interested in developing and expanding our metrics for narrative change. Can you offer some examples? So Anne, you were kind of throwing out some examples about, have I lifted up the voice of the person most affected? And, have I done this? Have I done that? I think this is where I think we need to go next, but even just looking at the structure of a story and where does the foundation come in, and where does it exist in the story? Is it the center of the story, or is it a player, right? Is the headline, we did this and we're great? Or is the headline, look at this community that rallied around, and yeah, we're in there too, right? So I think there are probably not sort of the quantitative metrics that we might think of in the way that we do with likes and clicks, but I think we can have checklists we can go through, right, where we say, let's just check ourselves and make sure we're doing this the right way. So that I'm really interested in. And we would love any further ideas that you have. If you go to the report webpage, there's also actually there's a webpage that leads to the report, and it has my email address there. And I'm also very findable, but we're really, really interested in hearing what tools you need to really make these changes, because as we said, this is just the beginning. So please do check out the report, spread the word, and get in touch with us. And if you're seeing people doing this as well, let us know. We want to have these good examples. We want to share them with the field. But we have had such a great time talking with you today about this report, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.